7. Art, I misguessed him. Got you dead.
Yep.
And we go into the final year of the game. Like, this is the fall, sorry, but like, this is rough.
Interesting that France only chooses to take one year, which is given that Italy built, I think, because they took off Bulgaria and they get plus Vienna points Naples, right?
We're building 2.
Okay. They got Budapest point number 4 as well, right?
Yes. Yeah, the fall they lost their building 2. Which means maybe Italy can defend themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Although, given what they've said so far.
Yeah.
Just also looking to see if Germany is net neutral because they go plus Warsaw Vienna. And England pivots. And where's this London? Don't know. Just whether you had any more insight into this sort of situation, but I guess it was on the inside.
I knew everything that was happening at this point in the game. I knew that England was trying to do stuff and was still ostensibly giving them a chance to win. But there was something, I don't think France was supposed to be in the English Channel last phase. I think they were supposed to be in Brest due to the and so when France did this, England was frustrated. And Germany, like Italy was supposed to do something different with Vienna. I know Germany.
Time for the... Ready, save the day!
And
Don't be such a bore! Trust me. Mark! Here it is! Don't doubt me! Leap praise, then break!
France is on 9.
Commission complete.
All the second places are on 7 and England is on 4. And so, and like if you look at that position, there's
I don't see how you get any more dots after this yet. Maybe if Germany helps you, like if that's the thing, right? If Germany is so annoyed at Italy that they decide to throw to you as the square as Italy doesn't want you to win, then maybe you've got a shot. But even then, I don't see really what they give you. They give you what giving you something, giving Moscow something, but the rest of your units, right?
maybe they could make it to Warsaw.
Yeah, but then you. Yeah, I guess that's true. So they could give you same things as both plus Warsaw to get you to 9. It only works if France doesn't take anything else and they pass up the easy dots on right? Assuming that Italy is just giving.
Yeah. So, in this winter, Germany comes to me and offers me to randomize one of us throwing to the other.
Interesting.
As
long as I'm
that's
lucky.
the thing that happens. He offers it to be heavily weighted in my favor. Very significant. I'm not going to disclose the odds to this because I think this is actually a relevant thing that people are going to use in the future. But I want everyone to know it was incredibly weighted in my favor, and I won the point. It wasn't a point, it was dice roll, but Germany agrees to throw the game to me at this stage. Because you're so pissed at Italy, like you wouldn't offer this if you wasn't already pissed, and like technically gives them a chance to win. But like, yeah, this is pretty great. England is pissed at France, so England and Germany still want France to win. And they're both willing to do everything they can to help me win the game instead. Because France pissed them off. And I need everything to happen. I need Italy to defend against France. Because if Italy doesn't defend against France, it's over. I need to get the dots against Germany without losing anything to Italy. Which is not trivial, given the density of fleets in the bed. And I need the tactics to work around France in the West. And by the way, I know that both England and Germany like each other more, and both of them are incredibly disappointed at the results of the dice roll, being that I was the one to win the game. And I am petrified the two of them are going to find a way to actually throw to each other. Because if I just look at the tactics on this board, it looks obvious to me that England has a much easier time of throwing to Germany than throwing to me. And I think there's a very real chance that England and Germany could coordinate to throw each other the game. And Germany has sufficiently pissed me off that I would rather see anyone else in the game win other than Germany.
Because they
Germany
worked
handled
with Italy one turn earlier.
the way that the couple turns back, the way that he's negotiated was terrible. I think that he like so he lied to there was one major turn when he was in Vienna and when he was in Trieste, excuse me, Trieste of Bohemia, and then he backed out of Trieste into Vienna rather than going to push for Budapest. So there was that turn back in '08, and then in the spring of '09, when he was still in Vienna, we were still going to work with him and help him out, but then he instead leaked the plans and told Italy what was going on. Instead of putting himself in Tyrolia and Bohemia able to retake Vienna, he made plans to go for Warsaw instead, and had no play in the south and just lost everything. So he like took his own win equity out at the cost of my win equity, put himself in this position.
Okay, so
Took his own win equity out at the cost of my win equity, put himself in this position. Took his own win equity out at the cost of my win equity, put himself in this position. Took his own win equity out at the cost of my win equity, put himself in this position. Took his own win equity out at the cost of my win equity, put himself in this position. Took his own win equity out, cost of my win equity, put himself in this position. Took his own win equity out, cost of my win equity, put himself in this position.
okay, so
And so,
I'm assuming that
yeah.
you're avoiding talking about this for exactly this reason, but I'm gonna call you out on it anyway. If the coin
Yeah.
toss had not gone your way, would you have backed out?
I don't have to confront that because it didn't happen. I have never lost a coin toss, but I haven't thrown as a result of a coin toss, and I don't intend to take a coin toss unless I think it's not gonna happen.
Alright.
Like, this was heavily weighted in my favor, okay? So,
Yeah.
I don't have to confront that.
Alright, I will leave that on that note for that.
And again, coin tosses, other people have done coin tosses, say 50-50s, this was a dice roll.
Yes.
And not of a D6. Okay? So it was unlikely to happen, but it could happen. And if the Great King wants to reveal it, then he can reveal it. The point is, I won the coin toss. I won the randomization, and I did what I could to get Germany to throw to me. Is how I feel about this. And I am not above using any methods to get someone else to throw to me. So
Alright.
yeah, not how I want this to go, but it is ultimately how it went. I would have preferred to just get him to graciously agree to give me everything the way that.
Got a little
Austria
something
and
for
Russia
you.
did. But whatever, it's fine.
Every time I study the automated industry complex, I can't help but feel that it's pure perfection. PAC directed production is no longer a cold, repetitive chore, but a living, breathing system of intertwining process loops. Absolutely ingenious. Enderman, I've got to try this. Come on,
So I threw them back to
please.
simulate the phase, like what I think they should do. Specifically, Norway needs the convoy to Yorkshire. And then
Oh,
English Channel
thanks.
should do.
Don't worry.
I'm expecting
Even if
Paris
it's a
going to Picardy, so English Channel needs to bounce. English Channel needs to bounce Picardy. And then we go for and then a support from Munich into Bruges made sense to me.
Find your admit.
But there were other lines about that one that we could have done. But I think like English Channel to Picardy and convoy to Yorkshire. But England doesn't want to do that for whatever reason. England wants to instead convoy to Eddie and send English Channel to
A moment of your time,
and then they
Enderman?
came up with the specific move sequence that this was slightly better against.
I'm really
I don't even remember what it was because the convoy to Yorkshire just handles everything better.
Yeah.
And then it means you can put two on London in the fall.
Yeah, I don't think the convoy to Edinburgh does anything at all, right?
Well, the convoys to Liverpool in case London goes to Wales.
Oh, that's true. But then so does Yorkshire, so...
Exactly. I don't remember what the but it's more likely to go through. I know. And so if you're trying to give they have to do it my way or the highway. And ultimately, it probably doesn't matter anyways, because France is probably going to get 2 more dots from Italy, and it's probably not going to matter. So like, why fight too hard? It's mostly irrelevant. France has just won this game, even with Germany agreeing at this late stage to help me win. And then, yeah, so we can see the spring tactics actually, just to see what the board looks like after the spring.
Okay, so you got pulled up here. Okay, this makes sense. I was wondering how are you gonna keep India with area south coast obviously can't help it, you've got to get this unit up. Makes sense, just completely surround it, like get up on this turn and that makes sense. Interesting that Italy bounced France out of Venice. I mean, is there anything else here that you want to call attention to particularly?
Yeah, I mean, Italy bouncing France out of Venice actually was a very relevant thing that I saw. It tells me that Italy and France haven't spoken that much, and there probably isn't an explicit arrangement between Italy and France to draw. And I'm looking at things, and okay, if I get Warsaw and St. Petersburg, assuming that Germany sticks through it, and given what Germany did this phase, I think that's pretty reasonable. Germany did exactly the moves I requested. Then, if I get these 2 dots, then I'm gonna. France is currently on 9, plus the Rome spot they got, that's 10. So, if France doesn't get any other dots anywhere on the board and loses one of London or Belgium, win again. So, there is a guess. There's only a guess because Norway went to Eddie. If Norway had called Eddie to Persian, then Nancy and Russia would have made and gone to Rome at the end. Right? Which is France stays on. Venice. I'm talking about Venice. But assuming France doesn't get Belgium, France can retake Belgium, guaranteed if they want, because France can have Ruhr tap Holland, English Channel tap North Sea, and then Italy and Burgundy working to take Belgium. You have to take it from Burgundy. There is a fleet in Belgium, so it can't do its open attack into Burgundy. And so it's a guaranteed capture of Belgium. This basically wins. You don't have to worry about losing position, like losing Burgundy or losing North Sea phase, because this is the last year. Last phase of the game.
Want a piece of cannon?
Wouldn't want to miss out on this hunt.
End up net -1 in the west, as we were being one of East Italy and so
Very professional move.
So Italy has to win the cast notes. And I need to get Italy to not give France. How do you think I should go about doing that effectively?
Actually, that's tough, right? Because if you go to Italy and just bank them or whatever, the way that they've responded makes me think you would like that thing last time it beats you, right? Because last time you got to them and said, hey, please, no, whatever,
make a good team.
This is the fight we want.
Threat hostile. Approach with caution.
Yes, and this was your last chance to get into the finals, right? Which means we are going to see you in the finals of this Olympus tour.
Yes, I will be in the Olympus finals.
Captain Mifu put me here specifically to keep folks out of this area. Kid, just listen to your old man and turn back, all right?
But I'm not just some outsider. I've been doing research here for years.
Still not happening. The blight inside isn't something you can handle. Once the Tianxia have cleared it out, then you can go back to your research.
But by then, they might already be...
Administrator, what brings you here? you hear about the Blight Tide affecting the test area too? Like I was just saying, the situation here is really bad. Lu, you're still a Tianxia disciple. Stay put right here, and let the Tianxia and the Administrator handle this.
I can handle it. I know the paths inside well. I know how to avoid the blight. Please, just let me in. I promise. Nothing will go wrong.
Lu, don't make this hard for me. The situation's too risky right now. If something happens to you in there, I really won't be able to explain it.
What am I supposed to do? Blockhead and the others? Hit, hit. Oh!
Enman? Lu? Don't tell me that you're still... All right, fine. For the Enman's sake, I'll turn a blind eye just this once.
Really? You mean it?
Honestly, letting you go in alone was a hard no. But with the Administrator on the case, I guess I can make an exception this time. All right. How about 1 hour? Any longer and I can't cover for you.
Only one? Can't we please just...
Lu, if you keep haggling, you won't even get the hour.
Okay. 1 hour it is.
Just a heads up. The blight in this area is no joke. Better make sure you're fully prepped before going in.
So, a few weeks ago, I wrote and published an editorial about Dropout TV, and honestly, I wasn't expecting the response to it that I got. Not because I didn't believe in what I was saying, but because I think a lot of us are feeling the same thing right now when it comes to entertainment and streaming. You know, we are overloaded with content right now. Every platform is fighting for our attention. Everything out there feels louder, it feels bigger, it feels faster, and it feels more algorithm driven than ever before, which I'm not sure is the right way things need to be. Somewhere along the way, a lot of what made entertainment feel personal started getting really lost. But Dropout just feels different. And after sitting with those thoughts for a while, I was lucky enough to get the opportunity to speak directly with the man helping lead that platform, meaning Dropout, and that's Sam Reich. I got to speak with him himself. So before I get into that conversation, I want to talk a little bit about why Dropout has resonated with me the way it has, and why I think it's resonating with so many other people right now. So like I said, right now there's really no shortage of streaming platforms that are out there competing for not just yours, but everyone's attention. Between the billion-dollar studios, endless content libraries, autoplay algorithms, and platforms consistently trying to keep you scrolling, the modern viewing experience has become less about discovery and more about saturation. There's always something to watch, and somehow at the same time, it's never been easier to feel like there's nothing worth watching. And that's where Dropout quietly separates itself completely from the pack. I've been watching Dropout for quite a while now, and honestly, I can't even tell you the first thing I watched on Dropout. I can't think back and tell you what it was anymore. I think it was an episode of Make Some Noise, but I'm not sure. I've been watching it for so long at this point that the exact entry point I entered into Dropout content is kind of a blur. And weirdly enough, I think that says something very important. Because what it means is that Dropout didn't win me over with one giant viral moment or one massive flagship show. It won me over with consistency. I'm sure, like a lot of people, I remember seeing clips of Game Changer, Make Some Noise pop up online, whether it be on YouTube or TikTok, you know, moments that genuinely at the time made me stop scrolling and go, what is this? Like, what am I watching? And not necessarily in the sense of just a quick laugh, but really genuine curiosity. It made me want to go and check it out. Once I started diving deeper into the platform, into Dropout, it became very clear, very quickly, that this wasn't just another niche streaming service trying to carve out a lane. Dropout had, by the time I found it, at the very least, had already found its identity. I mean, while a lot of platforms are chasing scale, Dropout has focused less on the scale, but more on identity. It knows exactly what it is. It knows who it serves. And maybe most importantly, it understands why its content works, why their content works. You feel that in everything, from Game Changer to Dimension 20 to Make Some Noise to Gastronauts to very important people. It doesn't matter what it is, you feel it. There's a consistency there, not just in quality, but in voice. Nothing feels overly manufactured. Nothing feels focus grouped to death. Nothing feels like it was built by a committee. There is just a looseness to the performances. There's a trust in the performers themselves. There's this willingness to let comedic or genius, whatever way you want to look at it, there's a willingness to let those moments breathe. And honestly, that is the kind of trust that is very rare when it comes to content and streaming and what we're processing nowadays. And what's surprised me most is that over time, how much that connection has managed to extend beyond the screen. I can tell you personally with my own friend group, people that I genuinely consider my family, we all have wildly different tastes in entertainment, in what we consume. It's actually pretty rare that one show or one platform overlaps across all of us as consistently. And yet somehow Dropout became that common ground. Whether we're quoting a game changer bit, or we're talking about a system being used in Dimension 20 that we're getting ready to currently do now, referencing some kind of thing that the Noise Boys did on Make Some Noise, or just bringing up moments that we watched recently. Dropout always comes up. It became part of our everyday vernacular. And honestly, that kind of shared connection is very, very rare. It's not just content that you watch, it's content that you talk about. It's content that you share, it's content that sticks with you. And because of that, something very interesting starts to happen. You genuinely start to root for the people involved. When someone like Brennan Lee Mulligan shows up somewhere outside of Dropout, like when he did an episode of Ted, or Jeremy Colhane lands on Saturday Night Live and he's doing Tucker Carlson impersonations, or Caitlin Riley pops up on At Midnight, or Vic Michaelis has her other projects, Josh Rubin's directing movies, you immediately have the reaction when you see them of, oh, that's awesome. You genuinely are happy for them. And that kind of emotional investment can't be measured. That only happens when audiences are able to trust the people behind the platform. And another thing that really elevates Dropout for me is how naturally inclusive the environment feels. And I want to be very clear here. I'm not talking performatively inclusive, not inclusion as branding. On Dropout, inclusion feels foundational. Different voices, different backgrounds, different identities, different perspectives, they exist naturally within the ecosystem of all of Dropout's content. And more importantly, the environment feels safe enough for performers to actually be themselves. That comfort translates directly to the screen. The comedy from the content, it just feels more natural because of that. The storytelling feels more honest. The interactions feel more authentic. And audiences can feel that authenticity. We feel it. And honestly, I think that's part of why supporting Dropout feels different too than just watching. Supporting feels just as different because we all complain about subscription increases now. We are rotating services. We question value consistently. Platforms are always raising their prices and we wonder, is it worth it? Dropout is one of the only platforms where I've genuinely had the opposite reaction. Instead of asking, is this worth it? Is the money I'm giving to Dropout worth it? I have found myself asking instead, how can I support this more? And I really do mean that sincerely. Like, I subscribe directly to the website. I subscribe through YouTube. I have gone to live shows. I've bought merch off the website, and not because I feel it's an obligation. I don't feel obligated to do these things. It's because it feels like supporting something built with actual care. It feels like supporting something I genuinely want to support. And after spending a good amount of time thinking about, after publishing that editorial, thinking about why Dropout resonates the way it does, I had the genuine privilege to sit and spend some time with the man who helped shape that vision, Sam Reich. And what followed wasn't just a conversation about Season 8 of Game Changer, which is coming soon. We didn't just talk about any conversations. We didn't talk about Game Changer, the Home Edition. We didn't just talk about Game Changer, the Home Edition. We actually had a pretty awesome moment about it. and you'll see that because it crossed the $1 million mark as we were talking. But it became more a conversation about creative freedom, about responsibility, about fandom, sustainability, and why audiences are connecting with Dropout in such a powerful way right now. Now, before we jump into the conversation itself, I do want to quickly mention and apologize in advance for those of you watching, for the video quality of the conversation with Sam. If you're listening, the audio is fine, but if you're watching, the video quality is kind of substandard. Both Sam and I were actually working with 4K cameras on our end, but unfortunately, once you're recording remotely through Zoom, you're kind of at the mercy of what Zoom decides to give you back when it comes to the final recording. So, the quality's not that great, and while I could have tried using AI enhancement tools to kind of upscale everything afterwards, I tried. I personally feel like those processes tend to create a really artificial look that takes away from the authenticity of the conversation that Sam and I had itself. Rather than overprocess it, I wanted to preserve the conversation as naturally as I possibly could. So I didn't use any of those AI tools on it, although I did think about it, and I tried it with small clips, but I just decided not to. And before I get into the conversation, of course, I also want to sincerely thank the people over at Creative Publicity for helping to make this happen and for giving me the opportunity to spend some time with Sam. I genuinely appreciate it. I've been working on this for probably almost 2 years now, conversing with them, and I kind of geeked out a little bit, but I want you guys to enjoy it. So here it is. Stay tuned when the conversation's over. I will come back, but here it is, my conversation with Sam Reich. Yeah, Sam, so I just want to say I'm so excited to have this opportunity to speak with you. I've been looking forward to this. Yeah, I've been looking forward to this for such a long time. If for nothing else, to just kind of say thank you, because Dropout has become such a regular part of my life and the conversations I have with the people that are close to me. It's, no matter when we're hanging out, something Dropout always comes up, whether we're talking about something. It's become part of our everyday vernacular. So if for no reason, for nothing else, thank you for that.
You can't imagine how fulfilling that is to hear. I mean, it really is like an entertainer's objective, just to be a part of the lives of some fans. And what's happened to Dropout in the last couple of years, just in terms of the people like you and your community that it's reaching, it's a total pinch ourselves scenario. I say this all the time. I might be in a coma in a hospital. If so, don't wake me up.
Wait, does that mean we're just a part of your dream sequence and we don't actually exist?
Yes, in the lore that I've established, you are my fantasy fans.
We're just NPCs in your dream. I kind of dig it. When you look back at everything, it feels like Dropout went from this best-kept secret to being now in legitimate Emmy conversation. And so I'm curious from your perspective, when did it feel like when did it feel like it shifted?
For us, it's a bit of a frog in boiling water scenario where I don't experience it as a seismic shift. I experience it as every year just a little more. But I also think a combination of maybe imposter syndrome and insecurity. I don't look at Dropout as more than that fledgling little company that we started out as. And any time we enter into the quote unquote
one shot, one kill
for any reason, I have the distinct feeling of being a little animated chinchilla entering into the big city for the first time, where I'm like, I've got my bindle on a stick on my back, and we're going to do the best we can, and we could be run over by a taxi cab.
But you know what, though? That's such a great humbling attitude to have, too. It's the whole never getting too big for your britches kind of situation. When you never look at yourself more than, like you said, that little company that you started so many years ago. But
yeah, for sure. I mean, we are still the little company that could, and there are lots of ways in which I think Dropout that hasn't grown up, and other ways in which I hope we don't ever grow up to be the kind of mainstream company or mainstream media company that dominate this industry. Like our kind of upstart status is part of our DNA. And by the way, if you look at like the really big fish, like the Netflixes and the HBOs of the world, or is it Max now, or is it HBO Max now?
Whatever it is.
Whatever it is.
Changing. It'll be Paramount soon at some point.
Yeah, or is it? Or is it Ellison TV? Whatever that is, they are so much bigger than we are that we could
Roger that.
combine the size they are, and we would still be sometimes less the size that they are.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
ceiling, let's just say the ceiling is far away.
Bullet.
But you know what?
Mark.
One of the great things that I love about
Downstairs.
Dropout, this just goes back to the support that we show, because I know I'm not just like this, but you're the one streaming service I know, and the one company I know that anytime I have opportunities to give you more money, I end up doing it. Like, I subscribe to the website, I subscribe to YouTube, and like I buy the merch. It's like anytime these other companies raise their prices, we bitch and we complain. But Dropout comes out and says, "Oh, we're gonna raise it." Sure, can we go higher than that? Like, let's go.
That was a funny day. We raised our prices for you, raised them for anyone who was an existing subscriber. And what we saw that day was that a huge number of people unsubscribed. It was a very high day for, and then resubscribed.
Yep.
So also a very high day for
There's
reactivation.
no escape.
Yeah.
from you.
Which
Roger that.
look, I mean, as a brand that's obviously a very
Pulling
fortunate
back down.
position to be in, but it's because the fandom is very passionate. And because I think the fandom sees us as the kind of company that they can get behind, not only because they like the product, but because they like the company and what it stands for. And we take that responsibility very seriously. We're in an unusual and fortunate position of having no shareholders and no private equity. So there's literally like no one at this company above me. Like the buck stops here at 5'7" or 5'6" inches. I almost lied about my height there. That was very funny.
We would have known. We would have known.
Are one with the wind.
But what that means is that we have what we feel like is a responsibility to both be very decent, and then the odd simultaneous responsibility of like running the company just pragmatically in such a way that's sustainable, so that we don't like fail vis-a-vis our idealism either.
Yeah.
So it's it's a low pedestal in the sense of like the stakes again of running this business are low as compared to running a business 100 times its size, but it's a pedestal the same, and we take it seriously.
Yeah. I kind of want to. So I've been monitoring something this entire time that we've been talking, and I'm sure you've been
You
monitoring
and me both.
it on your end too. The Game Changer Home Edition just launched not even 2 hours ago with a $40,000 goal, and while we've been talking, you just broke $1 million on the Kickstarter.
We sure did.
That
we
is
sure did.
unbelievable. Congratulations on that. That's huge.
Thanks, man. I think that's $1 million within 2 hours.
Yeah,
of-
less than
of
2 hours, because
launching.
you launched it, I think, at noon Eastern Standard for me.
Yeah, God.
How does that
That's
feel?
wild.
Like that's a huge. Did you expect it at all?
You really don't know what to expect with something like this. I think, look, for the most part, and I like that this is the case, to be a Dropout fan means to subscribe to us on a monthly basis, and that's all it means. And we actually want for there to be limited opportunities to express your fandom in any other way, because we don't want for the core Dropout fan to feel left out of anything. So what that means is that the opportunity to support Dropout in other instances is going to be sort of like one-off entrepreneurial efforts like this, or Superfan, which is a burgeoning effort for us as well. And you just like, you don't know how the fandom is going to show up until you ask, really. You can fantasize, but it's hard to put into metrics. It's hard to guess. So I think, I knew that there was a chance of something like this for sure. But we'll see how it continues to evolve. I will say this. I'm really proud of the game, and that's what's most important, because if all of these people were flooding into the campaign and I didn't like the game, or I thought the game was okay, this would give me tremendous performance anxiety.
Yeah.
And instead, what's really fun to imagine is that all these people are going to be playing the game.
Yeah, well, I mean, and I'm part of a group of TTRP gamers who, anytime there's a great game that comes out, one of us backs it because at least we'll have it and somebody will bring it to the table. But this is the first instance where I think like half of us are already backing or have backed the game. I backed it around within the first hour. I backed it, and I'm so excited for what it's going to bring. And that I got to talk to you when it broke that milestone, which is huge.
That's so funny. We were both looking at it. We weren't talking about each other. Totally a little hit of endorphin that neither of us, or a hit of
yeah. When you look, kind of going back to the whole Emmy contention thing and such, when you look at Dropout, Dropout kind of lived outside of the traditional system for a good amount of time, and now it looks like, through the Emmy campaigns and such, it looks like it's now starting to get recognized by that system that it's lived outside of. Do you kind of feel like it's the industry catching up to what you guys are doing with content on Dropout, or do you think it's maybe Dropout redefining what success looks like in regards to content?
I'll answer that honestly, Ben, which is to say that I don't know that the industry is really recognizing us yet. I mean, there is some corners of it that are. Variety's been very kind to us. Last year and this year, Variety put us on their short list who they expected to be nominated. But we're up in a category where roughly the same 5 shows, or 7 or 8 shows, with very few exceptions, have been nominated year after year after year. These are very traditional television shows. For us to be able to break through, it might take some more pushing before that happens. There are, I know the fans will show up, right? Like when we did Dimension 20 at Madison Square Garden, we played a 20,000 seat arena with Dimension 20 fans. When that happens, there are certainly people who sit up and take notice, for sure. But Hollywood is in a tough spot right now, and it's not. Hollywood is not adapting quickly.
Don't get careless.
And to the situation that it's in. And as a part of not adapting quickly, I don't think that Hollywood has exactly woken up to drop out of companies as service contenders.
Yeah, it almost feels like you said, kind of to your note, that it feels like Hollywood is almost evolving to the situation that they're in and giving in a little too much more than it should. Which, in essence, kind of makes Dropout stand out as a whole. That's what you're not doing.
Yeah, there's an element of that for sure.
Yeah. I know we're getting close to the end of our time, so I want to close out by saying that with Season 8 of Game Changer coming, getting ready to hit May 18th, we just had we were talking about the home edition that is obliterating its goal. What excites you most about what fans are going to experience, not just with Game Changer, but with Dropout?
Strength and finesse.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think with Game Changer, the real fun and privilege of Game Changer is that I'm in a very rare position as its creator, where I get to play around with a bigger and bigger pot of resources to create a show where there's no one standing in my way. And the way that sort of falls on over into Dropout and is something for fans to be excited about as it relates to Dropout in general is, at the end of the day, even as Dropout gets bigger, we're still a pretty small that is set up to be able to do pretty creatively interesting stuff. And I think that we are needing that opportunity. Like, I think that better ideas have come out of this group of people in the last year than ever before in its history as it relates to
Cycle of yin and yang.
programming, as it relates to Game Changer, as it relates to the company period. And I'm excited to work at a place where that's all possible. I feel like I'm sitting on a mountain of fun roll secrets.
I swear, anytime I watch an episode of Make Some Noise or Game Changer or anything that you're hosting, I'm like, I know there's so much work that's involved in producing that, but he looks like he has the best job in the world because he just gets to go to work and laugh every day.
I really do. I mean, it is absolutely an all-you-can-eat buffet of the best work you can imagine, and at times very filling. By which I mean not unstressful, but you could not ask for a better raw bar.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah. Sam, I so wish we had more time. Maybe there'll be another opportunity in the future.
I hope there is, Ben. I sincerely do. I'm sure there will be.
I hope so. I really hope so. But congratulations on the huge milestone of the Kickstarter for the home game. Congratulations on the upcoming 8th season, the Emmy contention, everything you've got going on. Thank you so much for spending a little bit of time with me. This was, if you could measure the smile on my face just from the excitement I had to be able to talk to you, it's been unreal.
That's very kind of you, man. I super appreciate your fandom and reaching out about this. And yeah, let's do it again by all means.
Yeah, absolutely. Sam, thank you again so much. So I hope you guys enjoyed that as much as I did. And after talking to Sam, I think what really stood out the most is the sincerity behind how this genuinely feels. Not just the creativity, not just the comedy, not just, of course, the success, but the responsibility. And at one point during our conversation, Sam had talked about how seriously they take the trust their audience places in them. And honestly, I think if there's anything to take away from this the most, I think that's it. That's the difference. Dropout doesn't feel like a company trying to endlessly maximize engagement or chase trends. It feels like a company trying to create something meaningful while respecting both the people making the content and, of course, the people. And in a media landscape where so much entertainment can start to feel impersonal, it can start to feel manufactured or disconnected, that sincerity genuinely matters. That authenticity matters. And I think that's exactly why so many people are connected with Dropouts right now. And of course, before I wrap this up, I have to send a huge thank you to Sam for taking the time to have this conversation. This was something, as I said, I've been looking forward to for a very long time, and I am incredibly grateful, not just for the opportunity itself, but for how thoughtful, open, and genuine the conversation ended up being. Hopefully, this is just the first of many conversations I'll get to have in the future with Sam. So, yeah, let's keep our fingers crossed and see. But as always, thank you guys so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe to Wilhelm on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also follow along on social media at Wilhelm Podcast, and make sure to visit welcometowilhelm.com, which is the official website for movie reviews, interviews, other editorials, and more. I promise there's a lot more coming. But until next time, everybody, thank you guys so much for being a part of this journey, and take care.
As they look.
This is it! It's recovered! What's this?
Ether normally build up rate, ice normally build up rate. Okay. Let's try this one first.
There are few phrases that annoy me quite as much as all relationships are transactional. This seemingly simple idea underwrites so many of our complaints about love and about one another. And yet, I think the arguments for it are remarkably weak. I was reminded of this when watching Louis Theroux's documentary on the Manosphere. And amidst everything else, I noticed that almost every person he spoke to behaved as if the transactionality of relationships was just a sacred truth beyond question. Because on the internet, cynicism is almost always the order of the day. There is an overwhelming tendency to spit on optimism or hope and claim that everything is awful and everyone is terrible. But this is a mistake, and here's why. My name is Joe Folly, and this is Unsolicited Advice. 1. The presumption of transaction. Okay, let's get the critique of this particular phrase out of the way before I look at its wider implications. Essentially, I think this phrase is what's called a deipity. This is a term coined by the philosopher Daniel Dennett that's used to describe a vague statement that has two interpretations, one of which is true but trivial, and another that is radical but false. So, everything happens for a reason is a classic deipity. It either expresses the mere idea that everything's been brought about by some kind of process, which is true, but it's also quite obvious, or it means that the world is following some kind of ultimate higher rationality, which, unless you're a theist or a stoic, is radical but false. A deipity can be really quite rhetorically powerful, because you can argue for the trivial version and then just sort of act like you've proven the radical version. You sometimes see this in manifestation circles, for example. Someone will argue for the weaker claim that our thoughts influence what we do and what we do affects reality, through the incredibly radical idea that our thoughts control reality directly, which is not true in any non-trivial sense. A deipity is, in effect, a ready-made motten baby. I put it to you that all relationships are transactional is a deipity, and later in the video we'll see that it's part of a kind of family of deipities with pernicious implications for our relationships to one another. So let's just take the phrase. All relationships are transactional. At one level, this might not only be true, but actively desirable. What would be the alternative of a transactional relationship? Would it be a totally one-sided relationship where one person gets absolutely nothing out of the pairing and the other one just parasitically takes? Well, this is hardly the model of interpersonal companionship that we want to promote. You certainly wouldn't stay with someone if being with them genuinely added nothing to your life, or at least I hope you wouldn't outside of some exceptional circumstances. Would the other person even properly love you if they wanted you to stay in that situation? So it does seem like there is some truth to the notion that all relationships are, in this sense, transactional. But the trouble is, the statement is often used to equivocate between two really different meanings of the word transactional. One of which is probably true, or mostly true, and the other of which is probably false, but is also radically cynical. Often the more plausible version that I've just given is argued for only for people to act as if the more radical, cynical version has been demonstrated. The two interpretations of the statement, as far as I can see, are roughly as follows. The broad interpretation of all relationships are transactional holds that relationships are transactional in the kind of wide sense that everyone should, over the long term, get something out of the relationship. Moreover, long-term, serious imbalances in what someone gets out of the relationship will likely lead to the deterioration of the relationship overall. On the other hand, the narrow interpretation of all relationships are transactional holds that relationships are tit for tat. If someone isn't getting exactly as much as you are out of a relationship, they will leave you in the immediate future. Moreover, one person's gain comes at a cost to the other person in this narrow interpretation. The difference between these two positions is really quite large, and it's also largely one of time horizon. The broad version is a long-term prediction. It can accommodate pretty large periods of imbalance so long as it doesn't reach a breaking point. The narrow version, on the other hand, is a very short-term idea. It suggests that even temporary imbalances in what one person is getting out of the relationship will set up a disaster. It also implies an adversarial or zero-sum relationship between the pair. It assumes that if someone is getting something out of the relationship, that is coming at a cost to the other person. The broad version just doesn't imply this at all. And the broad interpretation strikes me, for what it's worth, as relatively plausible, for the reasons that I've already given. But people often move from the broad to the narrow interpretation without noticing the immense differences between these two ideas. The broad version should, in my view, basically invite no cynicism. It just amounts to saying that people want to feel fulfilled in their relationships, and if they are behaving reasonably, that is part of what they will pursue in their decision-making around the relationship. But the narrow version paints us all as really quite myopically egoistic agents looking to suck our romantic partners dry for all they have. Now, I've had a few romantic relationships, and while they've had their ups and downs, I can't say that this tracks my experience at all, though perhaps I've been extraordinarily lucky. As we just saw, much of the difference between the two versions is scalar. The agents in the broad version are still deeply interested in what they can get out of a relationship, but the level of flexibility is much higher, and there's no assumption that happiness is zero-sum. This allows for you to be happy for your partner. Since the difference is, for the most part, in degree rather than kind, it can seem appropriate to use the same word transactional for both. But I think this is a really quite misleading mistake, because the difference between the broad and narrow interpretation has profound behavioral consequences. If the broad version is true, we shouldn't panic. I think that actually it doesn't have any kind of detrimental effects on our view of love or humanity. But if the narrow version is true, then I'd forgive you for swearing off romance entirely. It's quite a depressing way to think. Think about it this way. If the transactional nature of the relationship is evaluated over a very long period of time, let's say 5 years, then that's a really quite robust connection. It would take 5 years of not getting enough out of the relationship for it to collapse. But if all relationships only worked on the very short time horizon implied by the narrow interpretation, say a week or a month, then it would totally rob us of the ability to be confident that any of our relationships can weather hard times. If I may digress slightly, I imagine that part of the potential benefits of, say, being married is that splitting up is a total ball ache, and this naturally extends the time horizon of an evaluation. It means that things have to get really bad for quite a while before it is worth getting a divorce over it. Additionally, the idea in the narrow version that relationship satisfaction is necessarily a zero-sum game just seems false. It's cynical, but it's untrue. It ignores the fact that people can enjoy doing things for their romantic partner, especially if those things are appreciated. I don't think that that's even that unusual. It seems like a very common everyday experience. Even outside of romance, I'm sure most of us have bought a gift for someone and taken pleasure in someone else receiving and enjoying the gift. And that's not to speak of all the things that couples will enjoy doing together. If a couple goes out for a walk or has a nice conversation or sleeps together, this is something that they both enjoy and doesn't cost the other anything in emotional or monetary terms. I feel like this is so obvious that it almost seems strange to say it out loud, but two people can enjoy something together without that enjoyment coming at the cost of one another. The amount of pleasure in a relationship is not some fixed quantity that has to be fought over, as the narrow version implies. So, once we extend the time horizon and remove the idea that relationship satisfaction is a zero-sum game, then we can truly say that all relationships are transactional. But it's no longer that depressing, which is back to the broad interpretation. On reflection, we would kind of want most relationships to be transactional in this wide way.
Alright, Joe. Thank you for your input. Yes, I completely agree. Thank you for giving me input that this phrase, or actually phrases like that, can be interpreted in two ways. One is banal, and one is implied. Because in both cases, everything happens for a reason, and there is a transaction in relationship, any kind of relationship, I understand in banal way usually. Like, yeah, there is cause and effect, and yeah, whenever interaction with humans happen, it's, yeah, it is indeed not zero-sum game. I guess that's not something that I previously thought about. That's not a thought that came into my head, even though that is, yeah, basically the way that it is. I wonder if I need to reflect on this a bit more. Or am I happy with that amount? Okay, BRB. Jojo. I'm kind of annoyed by my life.
And probably most romantic relationships especially so. The alternative would be to say we should forge romantic relationships regardless of whether or not they make us totally miserable. And I think that would just require serious argumentation to support. There are a few exceptional circumstances I can possibly think of, but by and large the idea of broad transactionality in this sense seems perfectly fine and not at all depressing. But this channel is all about honing your analytic skills. And if you want to do just that, then I highly recommend that you check out today's sponsor, Brilliant. We all know that when people are arguing for the transactionality of relationships, they will often argue for the broad version that is relatively unobjectionable, pretty easy to demonstrate in some form, and relatively trivial. But they will then use that point to infer all sorts of cynical conclusions about romance. They've implicitly swapped from the broad version to the narrow version of this phrase. I notice this a lot in the so-called manosphere, as well as similar relationships content that's aimed at young women that's been shown to me by some of my friends. In both cases, the idea that all relationships are transactional was implicitly used to support a relationship ethic of, at best, kind of rough egoism, and at worst, outright, almost malicious exploitation. So, although this is quite an everyday logical mistake, it's just equivocating on the meaning of a term, it has really quite disastrous consequences for how we then approach our relationships. Because if we are locked into the narrow interpretation, then it gives us the expectation that romantic partners are always out to get us. And maybe in some situations this is true, but it's certainly not a helpful attitude for forging long-term bonds with other people. Now, I wrote something about this phrase on my Substack months ago to kind of, I don't know, purge my frustration. And in fact, this first section was adapted from that post. But I've been unable to stop thinking more broadly about this topic, because what holds for phrases like all relationships are transactional also holds for a variety of ideas that I think inculcate an unduly cynical view of the world in listeners. And I'd like to talk a little bit more about that now. 2. Egoism and the self-fulfilling prophecy. How often have you heard someone argue that all people are fundamentally selfish? I made a video on this topic quite a long time ago now, actually, and that video went into the philosophical variants of this position. But I want to revisit the idea here, because specifically in public discourse, I have a similar attitude towards this idea as I do towards all relationships are transactional. When I hear someone argue for this position, it normally goes something like this. When you act, you are, at some level, only acting because you are trying to get internal emotional fulfillment out of the action. Even when you're trying to do the right thing and behave selflessly, you must be getting some kind of internal reward for that behavior, or else you simply wouldn't be doing it. Either you're trying to assuage your conscience, or you genuinely take joy in doing good things, but either way, your motives are egoistic. In a very wide sense, I think this argument does hold. However, similar to the last section, once we adopt that wide sense, the argument also becomes basically trivial. If you expand the category of egoistic motives to include any and all emotional states, and then basically define emotional states as those internal states which motivate you, then you have proven that all people are egoistic just by moving definitions around like pieces on a chessboard. This is obviously not what we normally mean when we talk about someone being selfish or egoistic. Take the following description of a paradigmatically selfless person. This is John. Whenever John sees someone in pain, he feels so strongly that something must be done that he stops and helps them immediately. When he won the lottery, he had such compassion for those who had less than he did that he gave all the money away to charity. This person, under the above argument, would be egoistic. So whatever definition of egoism being used here trivially covers all or almost all possible human behaviors. To riff on a thought by Bishop Butler, surely this form of egoism has things slightly backwards. We praise the selfless person because of how strongly they feel for other people, not because they don't feel anything for others and somehow supernaturally act selfless anyway. Historically, taking joy in doing good things has often itself been considered a virtue. For Aristotle, the hallmark of the highly virtuous person is that they not only behave virtuously, but they do this in a joyful and effortless way. There's nothing in this trivial egoism that should make us despair of humanity in any way, shape, or form. But nonetheless, I often see people arguing for this trivial version of everyone is selfish, but then acting like this is a depressing truth about the world and implying that it should fundamentally shift how we see other people and ourselves. But this is pretty much the same kind of equivocation that we saw in the phrase all relationships are transactional. They've switched the meaning of the word selfish from the very broad version used in their argument to a narrower version that merely encompasses material self-interest, that is, only desiring your own benefit and never feeling compassion or fellow feeling or sympathy for other people. But we all know that that version of egoism plainly is false. We know that people do feel compassion and sympathy and are capable of being motivated by the suffering of others. That is empirically demonstrated each and every day. So, again, a trivial but true idea is swapped out for a radical and false idea with incredibly cynical implications at the last moment. There are more sophisticated versions of egoism in the academic literature that do attempt to thread this needle, but I've never seen them make their way into public discourse, and this is a video largely about public discourse, so I'll just set them aside for now. The trouble with both of the cynical mantras we've looked at so far is that although it is just, a simple equivocation fallacy, it really isn't anything special, they do impact how we perceive one another if we buy into them. An article by Dale T. Miller observes that people actually often do view one another as narrowly egoistic. To quote him directly, that the average person is a self-interest theorist, someone who believes we're motivated primarily by narrow self-interest, and one in the neoclassical mode at that, is well documented in general surveys as well as in more systematic studies. This is not to say that the average person totally disbelieves in selflessness, but at the very least, a belief in the widespread motivating power of narrow self-interest above most other factors has bled into our view of one another. We assume that narrow self-interest has a larger role, an outsized role in our motivation, whereas in fact it is simply one amongst many other motivating factors. And if you want to look at some more analysis of situations where I think this idea is helpful versus unhelpful and evidence versus unevidence, then you can check out my larger video on this idea right here that goes into a bit more of the general philosophical literature around the topic. In many ways, the idea that everyone is selfish sort of just is the same idea behind all relationships are transactional, but on a larger scale. If anything, I suspect that it's partly our underlying presumption that people are narrowly egoistic that causes these more domain-specific proclamations of selfishness. But in each case, it does involve flattening people's actual behavior and motivations in a major act of equivocation, and I think that's an error. But of course, the trouble in both the relationships case and the wider selfishness case is that they can become self-fulfilling prophecies. If you believe that everyone is out for themselves, then it only makes sense for you to follow suit. That is the reliable way to avoid becoming a sucker. We thus end up in a situation where the belief that all relationships are transactional and that everyone is selfish can actually beget narrowly egoistic behavior. Let's take the relationships example. I've seen sentiments from both sides of the sexual aisle online argue that relationships are fundamentally a matter of extracting as much as you can from the other person and them attempting to do the same to you, and the creator tends to present this as some kind of hidden truth that you, the viewer, can use to adjust your own behavior within your romantic pairings. And the solution these creators tend to offer is pretty simple, but also quite worrying. They think that you should try to do your best to extract much more from your lovers before they do the same thing to you. And within the framework they've introduced, this makes total sense, because under the presumption that all relationships are already transactional and extractive, and that there's no alternative to this mode of being, well, why wouldn't you try to get all you can out of the situation? I mean, that's what the other person is doing, and if nothing else, it's the only way to adopt a responsible defensive posture in an inherently combative situation. But this is a really quite concerning shift. Because the more people who believe that all relationships are fundamentally transactional, or that all people are selfish in this narrowly defined way, the more rational it becomes to genuinely behave in a transactional and narrowly selfish way towards others. While these ideas can start off as false, they have the potential to become more predictive simply by convincing more people that they're already true, and people changing their behavior as a result. Now, importantly, I'm not trying to fearmonger here. I'm not saying that a majority of people out there think that everyone is fundamentally egoistic in this narrow sense and have adjusted their own behavior as a result. What I am saying is that I've met people, and offline people, not just people on the internet, who are convinced of this deeply cynical vision of reality, and I don't know if they've adjusted their behavior as a result, but what I will say is that it would be rational for them to do so. And it is worth noting that the people selling this cynical message often do have something to gain from it. Most of the bigger content creators I found offering this cynical relationship advice had some kind of product accompanying it. For a lot of the more manosphere-y guys, it was some kind of dating coach thing or investment advice, with the marketing often being around how many women successful investments would get you. And on the other side, it was often also paid dating advice specifically based around getting a rich partner or extracting as much as you can from your current partner. But can't we see the conflict of interest here? A fear is created in the viewer, and then the solution is sold in the form of courses and apps and paid advice that is meant to insulate you from that fear, to turn you from the hapless prey of these egoists to an egoistic predator yourself. The whole economy of this plan doesn't work unless, first, a kind of general cynicism can be implanted in the viewer. I don't think many people start out wanting to extract instead of wanting to love. But once you've convinced people that everyone else already has the extractive approach and that you're the fool getting left behind, then it just makes sense, given that this is supposedly the only game available, that you would want to master it. The cynicism is the whole linchpin and philosophical foundation of the sales pitch. Ironically, this is the very thing that leads people into the hands of those genuinely looking to take advantage of them. And let's talk about cynicism more generally, because I think that it is a very complex property, for lack of a better term. And I think we really need to get a handle on where it works and where it can lead us astray. 3. The seduction of cynicism. On the face of it, cynicism is quite a depressing worldview. It doesn't seem pleasant to walk around utterly convinced that everyone around you is pursuing narrow self-interest. And yet, people do find it appealing, and I don't think they're being ridiculous or totally irrational in this. I see cynicism overall as a kind of beautiful mirage. In the short term, it seems exciting, and it promises to protect you from the evils of the world. But in the long term, it undermines the very things that would make you fulfilled. And that's kind of what we're going to explore in the next couple of sections. But first, let's have a little terminological housekeeping, if that makes sense. Cynicism, of course, originally referred to an ancient philosophical school whose most famous member is Diogenes of Sinope, who was known for practicing extreme asceticism and preaching that we should live close to and in accordance with nature, which for him entailed a variety of really quite drastic practices, including eschewing property or a house and acerbically criticizing those around him for blindly following established social mores. He was skeptical of almost all of the social norms prevalent in Athens and Corinth at the time, and considered them to be unnatural constraints foisted upon natural man. And he essentially existed in a kind of living example of rebellion against these norms. I want you to put a pin in Diogenes because we'll be coming back to him in a bit more detail in the next section. But over 2 millennia later, cynicism means something slightly different. I've been referring to the two ideas that all people are selfish and that all relationships are short-term transactional as cynical ideas. And I imagine that hasn't struck you as particularly strange in its usage. But modern cynicism isn't like a philosophical school where we can break things down into a relatively clear set of beliefs and practices, even if they varied between cynics. We'll instead have to abstract from the general set of things that we call cynical to a wider definition. Here's how the philosopher Samantha Weiss does just that in her paper Cynicism and Morality. Cynicism is 1, a stance of disengagement, and 2, of distrust, contempt, and or skepticism to differing degrees adopted towards humans, their institutions, and values, and 3, adopted as a response to a belief that humans are motivated only by self-interest, or more generally, that human beings are of little worth. So, first we see there is a doxastic component to cynicism, that is, a belief-based component. But there's also an attitudinal component. The cynic must both have a dim view of human motivation and action, and then also conclude that that is a reason to be vaguely disgusted by humanity, or treated as not worth very much at all. We've already seen the connection between the relevant beliefs and attitudes in our analysis of all relationships are transactional. The belief that romance is motivated by this narrow egoism, and thus that all relationships are a tug-of-war consisting of mutual exploitation, then encourages the believer to adopt an attitude themselves of cold exploitation towards their lovers, and generally a sort of an attitude of disgust towards romance, let's say. Weiss's paper also touches on quite a curious aspect of cynicism in this modern sense. Cynicism isn't really seen as a positive thing if you ask people directly. Sometimes it's outright condemned, and I'm partly doing that here. But at the same time, cynicism has a kind of allure to it that even I feel, and I think is basically undeniable. There's something kind of thrilling about being cynical. It's like you're grasping the dark heart of the universe, if that makes sense. It's the same unsettling excitement that we get when we learn about some of the really quite awful things that humanity has done to other aspects of humanity in the past. We get to think to ourselves, look at all these people who are blissfully unaware of the depravity of which humanity is capable, and yet I see the truth. In this case, it could even be a positive, since humanity is undeniably capable of awful things, and it's worth being aware of that, lest we blindly begin to repeat them. And I think that cynicism sort of trades on the same thrill of discovering some dark and forbidden truth about humankind. Vice also points out that there are some genuine virtues of cynicism in certain situations. This even holds for statements like all relationships are transactional, and even on its narrowest definition. There is one major benefit of such an attitude. It will stop you getting taken for a fool if you do actually end up with someone who does view relationships as transactional. Cynicism is often incredibly well tuned to point out where supposedly virtuous people are using a shield of outer virtue to hide inner vice. At its best, it can be a kind of ethical bullshit detector. For instance, the channel Galatea and Asis has a video going through a number of examples of so-called nice guys, people who make a big show of appreciating women or their wives, who then turn out to be nasty or unfaithful. A hardline cynic would not have ended up with such people because they would have been hyper-skeptical from the start. Additionally, Samantha Weiss says that a characteristic property of the cynic is disengagement, and disengagement is sometimes a positive philosophical value. We want to be able to sit back and carefully choose the aspects of the world that we wish to engage with and which we wish to let pass us by. Cynicism, of course, takes this to its absolute extreme by recommending a total disengagement from the world, or in particular domains, or only engaging with the world in an emotionally detached sense, where we're really just trying to maximize our narrow self-interest, and thus we're sort of engaging with the world in a disengaged, ironic, self-interested premise. However, all of this disengagement does come at a real cost. Weiss argues, and I would agree, that in taking this detached, skeptical attitude, the cynic will ultimately deprive themselves of deep human relationships. It makes forging a connection with any person, or making any sacrifice for them, or wishing their good for their own sake, a deeply irrational move. They wouldn't do the same for you, so why are you even bothering? In British terms, it makes any behaviour based on hope or faith or charity a mug's game. But, of course, these are the very behaviours that do allow us to forge deep connections with others and create long-lasting relationships. Having said all that, I do think that Weiss's analysis leaves out what I think is one of the primary pleasures of the cynic, and that is a felt sense of superiority towards others. Since the cynic is disengaged from the world and from relationships where other people are emotionally engaged and vulnerable, it allows them to sort of stand above the rest of us and laugh when our hope or faith in other people does inevitably go awry in some cases, because although not all people are untrustworthy and narrowly egotistical, some undeniably are, and we will make mistakes. That is, the cynic gets to indulge in the biting joy of thinking, I told you so, at relatively regular intervals. In epistemology, it's often said that there are two things that we want out of any belief system: to minimize false beliefs and to maximize true ones. We might make a similar remark about our dealings with other people. We want to minimize unwise interactions and maximize wise ones. Cynicism is the interpersonal equivalent of blanket skepticism, the unwillingness to believe in anything. But just as blanket skepticism only minimizes false beliefs and does not maximize true ones, cynicism only minimizes unwise interactions without maximizing wise or fulfilling ones. Thus, while it will never make you look like an idiot in quite the same way as being a credulous fool will, it doesn't come with the requisite benefits of genuine, experienced, practical wisdom. However, the lack of obvious blunders also gives cynicism the appearance of considered intelligence. Cynicism and intelligence have even become quite closely culturally intertwined, with the figure of the cynical wise guy who sees the world as it is cemented in popular culture. All of this, I think, makes cynicism a superficially helpful but ultimately disastrous approach to life. Outside of a few extreme situations where it might be empirically appropriate, it is self-isolation by 1,000 cuts. But beyond these personal harms, I want to think a little bit about what a cynical attitude does to the makeup of a society, and particularly with the trust of a society. I was reading some John Ruskin a while ago, and I was struck by this particular passage, so much so that I wrote it down in my notebook. We have lost faith in common honesty, and in the working power of it. And this faith, with the facts on which it may rest, it is quite our first business to recover and keep, not only believing, but even by experience assuring ourselves that there are yet in the world men who can be restrained from fraud otherwise than by the fear of losing employment. Nay, that it is even accurately in proportion to the number of such men in any state that the said state does or can prolong its existence. I think there is some real insight here. The extent to which we can reasonably trust one another is the extent to which we can relax in a community or a society. And, as we've already seen, the more people who promote the notion that everyone else is already a cynic, the more rational it becomes to actually adopt a cynical attitude. Again, I don't want to make any kind of grand claims about the downfall of civilization or anything like that, because I think they are overdramatic and hysterical, and they assume that cynicism is a new problem. It's not. That John Ruskin paragraph was written in the 19th century, and it already talks about the breakdown of trust within communities, or is at the very least worried about that. However, I do think that the more cynical we become in a given area, the more difficult it will be to build trust there. And considering just how important trust is to allowing a community to function, this is a pretty dangerous road to go down. Again, I don't want to catastrophize, but I do want to point out that this is a problem. However, there is a further complication and a further benefit to being a cynic that I would be remiss not to mention. It's something that I find quite difficult to acknowledge given my wider anti-cynical stance. It's that if you are in a community of relatively trusting people, it's often personally beneficial, at least in the short term, to be a cynic, even though that damages the social fabric as a whole. This is the position that David Mazzella, following Alex Keenan, calls the master cynic, the person who truly is just out for themselves and uses that to take advantage of the people around them who have more pro-social attitudes. I'll give you an example to illustrate this, because otherwise it can get quite abstract. Imagine that you were dropped on an island where there was total perfect trust. If you said something to someone, they would just believe you, and it wouldn't cross anyone's mind that you were lying. Well, if you did happen to be a cynical, self-interested agent, you could get quite a lot out of this situation. You could sell counterfeit goods at ridiculous prices. You could make elaborate promises to the most beautiful person on the island that you would make their lives wonderful, and they will believe you and want to be with you. You could basically become ruler of this island of perfectly trusting people overnight. Of course, in practice, what you'd probably do is manage to make a fair bit of money and get ahead in the society of that island, while at the same time destroying the underlying ethos of trust at work and ensuring that everybody ultimately loses. And I think that this is why I've been so critical of people who peddle cynical ideas that everyone is selfish or that all relationships are narrowly transactional. I don't think these are harmless ideas. I think they both harm the people that believe them and erode the limited trust that exists between us. That trust is a fragile thing. Once it's gone, it's quite difficult to get back. And the peddler of cynicism trades in pieces of this precious social trust for pure self-benefit. Their cynical proclamations apply most aptly to themselves. But things are a bit more complex than they first appear. I've been quite harsh on cynicism, but I also think that it would be far too hasty to reject it in its entirety. And to understand why, I think we need to take a look at the history of this strange term and rediscover some of its noble origins. 4. Cynicism within limits. What's the difference between Diogenes and your average modern cynic? Well, according to David Mazzella, in his book The Making of Modern Cynicism, one major difference, though it's not the only one, is that Diogenes' displays weren't simply negative. He was arguing for a particular ethical framework. When Diogenes criticized the social mores of Athens for being arbitrary and for taking us away from nature, and thus when he himself lived on the streets like a dog, he became a living embodiment and argument for abandoning those social mores. He showed that a person could live without them, and in his apparent joy and virility, he recommended this way of life to the people that surrounded him. When he told Alexander the Great to stop blocking his sunlight, he was practically demonstrating that his philosophy meant that even the most powerful person on the planet at the time couldn't push him around. And he did make genuine critiques of the way that ancient Athenians placed too much value on things like wealth and civic social status, critiques that we would probably agree with today. But these critiques ultimately stemmed from his own positive philosophy. He did want to improve the people that he spoke to, not simply degrade them, although you might argue that he went about that in a funny sort of way. A purely destructive cynic, however, doesn't stand on their own positive philosophy. They simply want to tear down everyone else's ideas about the world. When they present a vision of mankind as narrowly egoistic and say that they cannot amount to anything more, they don't say this to spur us to become better. It comes from a place of pure critique. But as much as I've railed against this kind of cynicism in this video, I do think that such a critique is sometimes important. Mazzella points this out himself in the realm of politics. The person who is totally disenchanted and cynical concerning politics may have actually seen things that are wrong with the political sphere that more hopeful people haven't yet picked up on. I think that observation probably is more apt in the realm of politics than it is in the realm of love, but there are more measured versions of the cynical ideas that we've looked at that can be genuinely useful. However, they're only useful if, alongside the destruction of an old idea, they involve the construction of a new one. Similar to the way Diogenes would critique the social system of Athens while offering up his own ethical framework in its place. Let's revisit the phrase, all relationships are transactional. There was a variant of this that was true. Relationships are transactional, provided that we take the word transactional in the broad sense that both sides are far more likely to stay and be happy if they believe that they are getting something from the relationship in the long term. This doesn't mean the entire dynamic is tit for tat, but in this more moderate form, what I've called the trivial form, it does encourage us to not take our lovers for granted. This is a good message, and it does rely on us recognizing that human beings aren't angels or Disney characters. We do also have self-interested motives as well as other interested ones. There is nothing wrong with acknowledging this, and if it does encourage us to not take our partners for granted, then it may even enhance our interpersonal bonds. It might make us reflect on what we are doing to contribute to our partners' lives. In this more modest form, this idea is directly opposed to being extractive towards your partner. It in fact advises you to find someone who takes natural joy in the same things that you do, such that you can both make one another happy without extraordinary amounts of effort against your natural inclinations. If you enjoy giving physical affection, then it encourages you to find someone who enjoys receiving it, and so on and so forth. At the same time, it does make us put aside that Disney film mode of love that many of us have grown up with in stories, where love itself, abstracted from any kind of action or behavior, is always strong enough to survive anything, and relationships should always be easy. A little touch of cynicism can be a good thing. Here are the kinds of useful questions that this broad transactionality thesis might raise. What do I want my partner to value and take pleasure in about me? What are the kind of things I want to bring to a partner's life and why? How do I make sure that I find someone who takes positive pleasure from the things I find easier to give? Through this framework, all sorts of interesting and valuable lines of thinking can start. You might not want someone who places too much value on your looks or your money, since those things are contingent, and in the case of looks, they will definitely fade over time. You might instead place a high priority on finding someone who values aspects of your personality, because those aspects can be longer lasting, and at the very least you would almost always be able to provide that, and thus provide something that brings them pleasure. You might reflect upon what duties you think you and your partner have towards one another to ensure that you both keep getting something out of the relationship. These, in my opinion, are fantastic questions and thoughts to have, and they can be prompted by this kind of moderate cynicism. This would involve, however, the construction of this new ideal for the relationship, one that takes into account the elements of the cynical critique that are true. And asks where we can go from there. Or take the phrase, everyone is selfish. If we dial this down to just acknowledging that people do have their own self-interested desires, and that we should take that into account when we interact with them, that's both true and potentially very, very good advice. We shouldn't walk around the world thinking that everyone always wants what's best for us, regardless of the cost to themselves. That's absolutely ridiculous. Moreover, not acknowledging what is in other people's interests could lead to us being overly selfish or thoughtless ourselves. It is generally good practice to take other people's desires and wishes into account when we're making our own decisions. So, again, the simple observation, when it's devoid of contempt or scorn and doesn't give up hope for humanity, can actually be rather helpful. However, and I think this is really important to note, it's not just as simple as saying that there is a definite middle point between cynicism and naivety that we all need to find and then we'll be happy forever. I think the concept that we're lacking here is a developed notion of phronesis, or practical wisdom. This is an idea from Aristotle which essentially defines how we ought to apply different virtues and characteristics in different situations. To give a trivial example, it is knowing that a battlefield requires more courage than an important work meeting, and so on and so forth. Something Aristotle is quick to emphasize in the Nicomachean Ethics is that phronesis isn't the kind of thing that you can teach people from first principles and then just let them run with it. It's something that we gradually learn by engaging with the world, until eventually it is automatic and instinctive. In epistemic jargon, phronesis is a kind of procedural knowledge. A classic example of procedural knowledge, and incidentally of tacit procedural knowledge, is riding a bike. This comes from the 20th century philosopher Michael Polanyi. When you ride a bike, you're not just drawing on explicit propositional knowledge about where it's appropriate to ride that bike and so on. You are drawing on tacit know-how about how to stay balanced on the bike and how to steer it just right to rebalance if you wobble, and how to coordinate your pedals with your handlebars and so on. If I were to ask you exactly how you know all of those things, you probably wouldn't be able to tell me, and you certainly couldn't teach it to me propositionally, but you can perform them all the same. It's something that you have to learn from experience. And I suspect that the process of navigating trust in interpersonal relationships involves phronesis or something slightly analogous to it. It involves taking everything you've experienced about a person and all your past experiences and then using that to make a semi-conscious but also quite instinctive judgment about their relative trustworthiness and the extent to which they merit a cynical approach, and thus which virtues and characteristics are relevant to bring to the table in that interaction. But this is a trial and error process. It's not something you can teach someone merely propositionally. It involves getting stuck into real-world social situations, trusting some people, and seeing how it goes. I don't think it's a coincidence that much of the cynical content regarding romantic relationships is specifically targeted towards very young people, and especially teenagers. These are people that don't necessarily have that much experience with in-person romantic relationships, and so they don't necessarily
fortune seems pretty good lately.
Necessarily have the kind of practical wisdom that will allow them to confidently judge who is worthy of trust and who is worthy of wariness. At the same time, they probably know that love is important, and they're probably aware that they can get quite badly hurt if they fall for the wrong person. So there is a real incentive to figure out some principle by which they can ensure that they don't go wrong. So essentially, you have a population of inexperienced, scared people who simply don't want to get hurt. This is the perfect market for an extreme destructive cynicism, because the one thing that it can genuinely promise is that you are less likely to get hurt if you follow it. You just have to read the small print to figure out that it will deprive you of an awful lot of joy as well. Effectively, I think that this destructive blanket cynicism can function as a way to avoid the messy business of acquiring practical wisdom in the realm of interpersonal relationships. It takes all the bewildering complexity of figuring out how other people work, developing our ability to understand them, developing our own interpersonal virtues, finding out who has our best interests at heart and who's taking us for a ride, and then managing those virtues and characteristics in those specific situations, and attempts to boil it down into one or two principles that are just meant to keep you safe from harm. It's the every gun is loaded theory of other people, except we lose basically nothing from assuming that every gun is loaded, and we lose an awful lot by treating everyone as loaded guns. It's a poor substitute for real experience, but it's still a substitute, which is why it can be sold so effectively to the inexperienced. And of course, approaching your life in a cynical way does make it more likely that others will come to view you as self-interested and respond in kind to you, because now they're defending against your cynical outlook. That is, the more cynical you are, the more people will learn to be cynical towards you. So eventually it will just seem like you were right all along because your behavior has closed off all alternative paths. And I think that's what I find most pernicious about cynicism. It traps the cynic in a self-perpetuating cycle where their own cynicism becomes forever reinforced by the way that people respond to that cynicism. This doesn't just occur at the societal level, but it also just occurs at the straightforward personal one. It's a shame, then, that this message is being shown to the very young and the very inexperienced about love every day, millions of times. I would say that they're only making themselves miserable, but the truth is, they'll take many other people down with them. However, to draw again on Mazzella's work, I don't think we should spend too much time critiquing just your average person who comes to a cynical view on love or on their relationships with other people. Ultimately, they aren't the master cynic. They're not the person seeking and achieving their own self-advancement directly at the cost of other people. That role belongs to the people actively pushing and profiting from this message, as well as those who take that message as an excuse to treat the loved ones in their own life very poorly. The problem isn't necessarily that people are sometimes discontented about the state of love or relationships. These areas of life just are difficult and vulnerable, in some ways that are unavoidable, and some ways where I think we could listen to certain cynical proclamations in order to disabuse us of notions that are far too idealistic, like the Disney picture of romance we touched upon earlier. Instead, it's the people who make this hopeless, cynical attitude justified, either by spreading their cynicism with spurious arguments or by demonstrating it in their own exploitative approach to the people in their lives, who are causing the real damage here. I largely don't want to point and laugh at the person who's bought snake oil. I want to prevent the snake oil salesman from rolling into town again. Now, I don't really have a neat thesis to give you at the end here, because my overall point is that knowing when cynicism is appropriate is not the kind of thing that we can flawlessly theorize about in advance. It takes on-the-ground knowledge to learn how to navigate this. However, I wanted to emphasize the strengths of the cynic in this last section, as well as their weaknesses, because I do think there is a place for cynical critique. I just think it must be paired with a similar will towards constructing new ideas and goals and ideals to take the place of the old ones that the cynic has attempted to dispense with. Cynicism can be absolutely fantastic, so long as cynicism isn't the end point of our inquiry. But so often it is far easier to critique existing ideas than to build new ones from the ground floor up, knowing that these ideas will be imperfect and will require further work and refining. But, at the very least, if you are going to be a total cynic, don't be one because of any of the arguments we've looked at today, because they absolutely do not work. And if you want to know what I think is behind some of the modern-day complaints about love, I have a full video on just that right here. Thank you so much for watching, and have a wonderful day. A total cynic. Don't be one.
Strength is one of those things where you gotta use it or lose it. So, wanna train with me sometime? Running late again. Thank you for add Astra. My parents always say, no matter how busy life gets, you should always sit down and enjoy a proper meal when you get hungry. What I like to do is stack my plate up high, then squash it all down, take a deep breath, and wolf it down in one go. That way. There's a lot that goes into managing an orchard. Watering, weeding, fertilizing the soil, making sure the temperature is right. But most importantly, you have to keep the fruit in a good mood. This realm is if you ever
looks like that's it for today. Alright, that's it for today, I guess. That's going to be it for the stream. Good luck, fun, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.